In this episode of Pilbara Insights, we'll discuss the results of a recent joint analysis project undertaken with the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Melbourne, specifically looking at what factors influence the cost of teaching, including field of education, delivery mode, campus location, and subject size.
So it's really important for public policy purposes that we get a sense of what resources are required to provide really quality education to Australian and international students. Understanding what drives cost in higher education is a really fiendish challenge. And so when we did this, we found that subject size really was the dominant factor that was differentiating between the different costs of subjects. So this analysis has some, we'd say, reasonably significant implications for thinking about where we might take funding reform in the future.
You are listening to Pilbara Insights, the podcast, the first dedicated audio series to support higher education leaders in their academic resource management decisions. The series will showcase the industry's most respected and experienced experts, explore the topics of program review and optimisation, course evaluation, faculty effort, departmental research, planning and budgeting, and the key benefits of activity-based cost modelling for evidence-based decision-making.
Hello and welcome to episode 6 of Pilbara Insights. I'm your host, Lee Patterson, and today I'm joined by Dr Gwilym Croucher, who is a researcher at the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Melbourne, to discuss our joint research project on the cost of teaching here in Australia. Hi Gwilym, how are you?
Great, and a pleasure to be here, Lee.
Just to provide a bit of background to our listeners, Pilbara provided detailed data from our cost models of 11 Australian institutions covering the group of 8 metro and regional institutions. Now, all of this data was provided with the institution's permission and was anonymised and aggregated for analysis purposes. Then we handed it over to Gwilym and his team to analyse and look for the key insights. So, to start with, Gwilym, can you please tell us a little bit about the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education?
Thanks, Lee. The Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education is a research centre in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne. We're dedicated to improving and utilising the best evidence for professional development and for policy influence and practice in higher education. So we have a number of different research and teaching activities. And we're actually the second oldest centre of this type in the world. We were established in 1968, just after the first centre, which was at the University of California, Berkeley, was established to look at higher education and study higher education.
1968. Great year of my birth. Hey, what was your motivation for doing this cost of teaching analysis?
So there's a couple of reasons that we were really keen to do this project. The first is really because Australian higher education is still largely funded by the government. It's funded by public money. So it's really important for public policy purposes that we get a sense of what resources are required to provide a really quality education to Australian and international students. And of course, part of the policy question is really based on understanding what the cost of teaching is across the whole lot of different vicissitudes. And that's leads me to the second reason we're really keen to do this, is that understanding what drives cost in higher education is a really fiendish challenge, as many people will be aware. So, while a lot of CFOs and senior leaders in universities have a really good sense of what the cost drivers are in their own institution, given their particular circumstances and depending on where they're located, we really do lack systematic and publicly available evidence across all Australian higher education. And that goes back to the point I made before about, for public policy purposes, it's really important to have this evidence.
Yeah. And from this study, what were some of the key findings that came out?
We had quite a few interesting key findings that came from the study. But before I talk about those, I might just say a little bit about how we approached the analysis.
Sure.
As you said in your intro, Lee, we had this large anonymised data set from 11 universities. And what we did is we took the cost data for 1 year and we broke it down into basically subject level. right? And the reason we did this is because it allows a fairly fine-grained analysis that could examine field of education, mode of delivery, where a particular subject was delivered, the campus location, and importantly for the analysis, as I'll talk about in a moment, the size of the subject and what influence that had on cost per equivalent full-time student.
Yep. And so what did you specifically find, Gwilym?
So when we looked at the data set, we did the analysis at a couple of different levels. So when we looked at the median cost per equivalent full-time student by field of education, it shows that across all the different FOEs, all the different fields of education, postgraduate subjects consistently cost more, and so did bachelor subjects, which is, to be expected.
Yep.
When we examined subject delivery mode, right, so this is whether it's on campus, online, or a mixed mode delivery, we found similarly for the median cost that postgraduate was more expensive per student and sub-bachelor was least expensive per student.
Yep.
Now, it's a bit more complicated when we looked at the influence of subject campus location. So that's whether or not a campus is located in a major Australian city, or indeed whether it's located in an inner regional area, an outer regional area, or a very remote area, and this is based on the Australian Bureau of Statistics classifications for remoteness, which is a pretty common way to understand things like population density, access to services, and a whole lot of other factors that we find important when we're thinking about student experience, but also how expensive it is to run a particular campus. So looking at this disaggregation, there's evidence that while the postgraduate coursework subjects were often more expensive, they weren't always more expensive across the board. So disaggregating through these factors created quite a complex picture. So what we did next was we built a model which incorporated some regression analysis and some other types of analysis to really try and untie the different factors here. And the really key thing we added to this was subject size, to look at the influence of subject size on cost per student. So when we did this, we found that subject size really was the dominant factor that was differentiating between the different costs of subjects, which in some senses is probably pretty understandable when we think about it. You've got one lecturer, one teacher per subject.
Yep.
And that, irrespective of the number of students, often it's quite hard to scale at different times. So we built a model to look at how these different factors interact and try and untie them. And the really key thing we did with this was include subject size in the analysis. So when we undertook the modelling exercise, we showed that subject size was accounting for about 60% of the variation in the cost per student across all the subjects that we examined.
Yep.
And this is pretty interesting. So one way to think about this is to compare the cost of a subject and just change one or two factors at a time to see what their influence is overall.
Yep.
So what we did was we compared a subject to an on-campus metro bachelor level student, right, and examined what the different factors do in terms of cost. So, for example, compared to that on-campus student, if that subject was delivered online, the model estimates that it would cost about 15 to 30% less. But if it was mixed mode delivery, the model thinks that it will cost about the same as on-campus delivery.
Yep.
Similarly for sub-bachelor, which we found quite interesting. So once we've accounted for all these factors, compared to on-campus bachelor subject, the sub-bachelor cost about the same.
Yep.
Whereas the postgraduate subject probably in the model was showing probably cost 5 to 15% more. And the really interesting thing for us was the influence of field of education. Now, field of education certainly had some impact on the cost of individual subjects in the model, but there was no consistent pattern, or it was such a small effect that was really hard to untie.
Yep.
And really made us think about the cost cost of education divided up by field of education was really, a good and consistent way to do it. And similarly with, regional campuses. So in our model, we were able to estimate that compared to the sort of metro bachelor level student, if that same course was delivered at a regional campus, it may cost 10 to 20% more. But once again, it's difficult to make any, firm conclusions on that based on the evidence we had.
Yeah. And in fact, I think it's important to actually note that the data we were looking at was 2019 data. So this is pre-pandemic data, because I know there was a lot of rushing moving courses online, which would have had a significant impact on the cost of actually delivering in the online mode. So what we're looking at here when we're looking at online delivery are those mature online courses that are being delivered. And something else which is interesting too is that the increase in cost for regional campuses could have something to do with the class size as well, because they could have a number of smaller classes across multiple campuses and multiple times. So having courses repeated out there will add to that overall cost as well.
And that's really the challenge of trying to untie what the influence of regional campuses is, and while we can account for that class size to a large degree, we can't fully account for it in the model. So it's certainly something that we're, interested in doing more work on.
So what do you think some of the implications are for government funding?
So this analysis has some, we'd say, reasonably significant implications for thinking about where we might take funding reform in the future. So, as many people will be aware, funding for undergraduate teaching in Australian universities is differentiated largely by the different disciplines, the field of education. And although it's a bit more complex than that, certainly that's a key factor that informs how the Commonwealth Grant Scheme works, and indeed what the overall CSP rate is. So looking at this analysis, it suggests that maybe that is not necessarily the best way to divide up funding for undergraduate, postgraduate and sub-bachelor courses in Australia, and that we need to think more carefully about whether such stark differentiation is really serving well, or whether it's forcing institutional managers to have to move money around internally when some subjects are perhaps receiving more funding than they need and others are receiving less, or indeed whether or not we're not fully accounting for different factors such as campus location, or indeed whether online delivery is necessarily significantly cheaper or whether it costs about the same. So that's probably the first implication, is that it does raise questions about the current funding model. And as many people will be aware, the current funding model is largely developed during the period when John Dawkins was minister, at least the conceptual basis for that. And that was based on something called the relative funding model, which really divided up between, those STEM and HASS, bench-based disciplines and others, that primarily were in classrooms. And that has flown through over the last several decades to inform the current funding model we have.
Yeah, and when it comes to that funding too, I think you went into some of those lower levels of field of education as well, and having a look at those sub-areas under things like engineering and health, and seeing what the differential was between those.
Yeah, when we examined some of the disciplines like health and education, as you mentioned, at the high level, the 2-digit FOE, it can seem like there are some quite stark differences between them and, say, HASS disciplines. But when we looked at a more granular level, and this is certainly something we will be doing more work on, it shows that there's a huge variation within those, broad groupings. So there are some, for example, engineering subjects that were quite high cost, and there were some that were lower cost, irrespective of when we account for the number of students who are in there, the degree level and all those other factors I talked about before.
Yeah. And do you think there are any key takeaways for institutions themselves from this analysis?
There should be some really useful takeaways for institutional managers in this analysis, and certainly in some future analysis that we're undertaking to look at a lower level. And it does show that there probably are some common cost drivers across the sector, and that, while each institution will have its own set of factors, this provides that really high-level view that we're lacking in the public domain at the moment.
I think it's interesting that the results out of this research, although they're self-evident, it's actually good to have them confirmed and quantified with the data from all those various institutions.
Yeah, and it's often hard when you look at a detailed analysis of one particular institution just to know how much is common across the sector. And while we often have a sense of these things, having that data out there is helpful for all of us.
Yeah. And any other areas that you think require follow-on analysis?
There's certainly a lot more work to be done to really understand what the differences are at that more granular level between different fields of education, and certainly to think about what other factors are driving cost here regarding staffing mix, whether or not some subjects that are led by more senior staff versus more junior staff, or indeed how scalable it is to have casual or temporary staff come in as well, how that's influencing costs. But of course the real challenge is thinking about quality and quality of education, and that's something that is going to require a lot more work from a lot more people. But it's really helpful to have this kind of data out there because it can start those conversations in terms of what the cost drivers are.
Yeah, quality is a really important point, and comparing that to the cost of teaching.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much for your time today, Gwilym, and I'm looking forward to seeing this paper published.
Thanks very much, Lee. It's been an absolute pleasure to join you.
Cheers, mate. Bye.
You have been listening to Pilbara Insights, the podcast, the first dedicated audio series to support higher education leaders in their academic resource management decisions.
Pilbara Group would like to give special thanks to Dr Gwilym Croucher for his contribution to the analysis project and today's podcast. Thank you also to all of our listeners. This is the final episode in Series 1. If you missed any of our episodes, you can catch up now and learn more about academic resource management, program review, planning and budgeting, research management, and course evaluation, and understand how activity-based costing can support your institution's operational and strategic management challenges.